Today we are looking at one of the most spectacular chess games ever played, produced by the epic collision of two of the fastest rising stars that our beloved game has ever seen. The mighty Mikhail Tal, who at the time of this game is only 22 years old and less than a year from becoming world champion, and the great Bobby Fischer, who at the age of 16 is still in the early stages of what is to become the most stunning ascent to legendary status that has ever been seen in any competitive endeavor. The year is 1959, the place is the beautiful city of Zagreb in Croatia, at that time still part of Yugoslavia, and the stakes couldn't be higher, as this is the final candidates tournament to determine who will be challenging Mikhail Botvinnik the following year for the World Championship. So both of these players are hungry, they're both attacking geniuses of historic proportion, and this game does not disappoint. You're going to see insanity on the board as Bobby Fischer makes a move that comes as an absolute shock to Mikhail Tal. But is it enough to throw him off his game? Well, you're about to find out. Tal, playing white, initiates this incredible struggle with d4. And from Fischer, we have knight to f6. He's going to be heading straight into King's Indian land after c4 and g6. This is Fischer's bread and butter with black. He's a hypermodern guy, although that trait is pretty much limited to his chess, from what I've gathered. We have knight to c3 and bishop to g7, allowing Tal to get that big, beautiful center with the move e4, which of course will not go unchallenged. Fischer continues with the multi-purpose mainline book move d6, freeing his light squared bishop and supporting either e5 or c5 to challenge white's center when the time is right. This also discourages any e5 from white to kick his knight off f6. Bishop to e2 next from Tal. Knight to f3 is a tad more popular here, but with bishop to e2, he's keeping a little flexibility with his dark squared bishop, since if black castles, which Fischer now does, one popular line here is bishop to g5, just baiting black into h6, when the bishop will typically drop back to e3, where it cannot be harassed by any knight to g4. Since the bishop is watching over that square, this wouldn't be the case if white had played knight to f3 instead of this move bishop to e2. But here, for reasons that Tal took with him to the grave, he decides to transpose back into the mainest of main lines with knight to f3. So Fischer strikes at that center, like you should always do in this opening, with e5, to which Tal responds d5, which would later become known as the Petrosian variation, named after the boa constrictor of chess himself, Tigran Petrosian. Which reminds me, I have been meaning to do a video on Petrosian, so let me know in the comments if you have a favorite game of his. But anyway, this move d5 is not quite as popular as just castling, but it is very strong, just seizing that central territory and looking to keep black cramped and deprived of all counterplay. But Fischer has his response ready with what is now a very vintage move, knight b to d7. These days, top players prefer to play a5, followed by knight to a6, looking to possibly jump into c5, while keeping the light squared bishop's diagonal open. But this is 1950s chess, and knight to d7 is just what one plays. Bishop to g5 now from Tal is still a very popular move today, pinning the knight, and inviting the move h6 from Fischer, putting a question to that bishop that I've been asked myself on more than one occasion by my friendly local law enforcement, which is, where are you headed tonight? Which Tal now answers with bishop to h4, inviting Fischer to kick his bishop back even further with the move g5. Now Stockfish is hooting and hollering here, saying just do it, push that pawn, kick that bishop back, follow up with knight to h5, and enjoy a totally equal position. And this is what a lot of players will do today, despite all the open space that this will create around the black king, because they have put their faith in the almighty engine, as we all do nowadays from time to time. But others, like Fischer in this game, prefer to keep their pawns a little closer to their castled monarch, and so will typically go for a5 instead, watching over b4 so that knight to c5 can be played next without being kicked away with the move b4. But Fischer has a different plan. He plays a6, which is significantly inferior to a5. He's decided he wants to break this pin on his f6 knight, and the way he's going to do it is with queen to e8. But he's got to stop the move knight to b5 first, since after queen to e8 that would come with an annoying threat of knight takes c7 with a fork. But this now gives white a sizable advantage if he immediately plays knight to d2. But Tal castles first, which isn't as good, since for one thing, it gives black another chance to play g5, followed by an immediate knight to h5, which wouldn't be possible if the knight were on d2, since this would open the e2 bishop's eyes to the h5 square, thus preventing that move knight to h5. Another reason you might not want to castle is that if g5 is played, then you still have h4 with the threat to open the h-file and bring this h1 rook to life. That could be very dangerous. But Tal castles, after which Fischer again rejects what may be his best move in this position, g5, and sticks to his alternative plan for getting his knight off at f6, which is queen to e8. Breaking that pin, and in case anyone doesn't know why he wants to vacate this f6 square, well, it's so that he can play f5. That's the key pawn break here for black, to start breaking down white's oppressive pawn triad in the center of the board. So Tal now plays knight to d2, which is still the best move, preventing that f6 knight from going to its most active square, h5, leaving Fischer with the inferior alternative, knight to h7. Tal now continues with the excellent b4, preventing knight to c5 from being played at some juncture, also supporting a possible c5 after knight to b3 to further prepare it. But it kind of looks like black is ready to get his big pawn break first with the move f5. But Fischer didn't play this, because after e takes f5, if rook takes f5, then bishop to d3 followed by queen to c2, ganging up on the g6 pawn is no good for black. But if you play the standard g takes f5, black would be doing very well here with this beautiful pawn duo and the opened g-file with king to h8 and rook to g8 on the cards, if there wasn't this little problem with the move bishop to h5. And when I say little, I actually mean big, as in black is losing. Because where are you going to put that queen? You're not going to put that queen. You're going to have to put that rook to f7, or else you're going to lose your queen. She's got nowhere to go. So this just loses the exchange for no good reason, which is why in this here position, Fischer goes for bishop to f6, which is probably as good a try as any in his now inferior position, offering a piece trade, which is typically a good idea when your position is cramped, and this is his bad bishop to boot, being blocked by his own central pawn. Now, Tal could avoid this trade with bishop to g3, but then Fischer's bishop can get active with bishop to g5, and if you try to kick it with h4, then bishop to f4 is actually a good move. So Tal just plays bishop takes f6, which is the best move, and after Fischer recaptures with knight h takes f6, we have that knight to b3, which is yet another flawless move by the great Tal, stopping any a5 from black. He of course doesn't want this a8 rook to start participating in the game. He's also supporting the pawn thrust to c5 very soon, so he's got a well-defined plan, while the young Fischer on the other hand is no closer to playing his thematic f5, and finding himself adrift, rudderless in a sea of uncertainty, now plays the utterly meaningless queen to e7. Of course, I'm only kidding. As long as Fischer is making moves, you know he's going to have some kind of plan, and this move is highly useful, preventing the immediate c5 by adding another attacker to that square. So Tal continues sensibly with queen to d2, attacking the pawn on h6, Fischer defends with king to h7, and Tal puts his queen on e3, renewing the possibility of playing c5 by adding a defender. And if you happen to be new to chess and wondering what's this big obsession with the move c5, well, to put it as generally as I can, it's usually a good idea to attack your opponent's pawn chain as close to its base as possible. This, of course, being the pawn chain. So this is why c5 is a good move, attacking d6. And this is also why black wants to play the move f5, attacking e4. And if you want to know more about why this strategy works, then I recommend getting a good book on pawn structures, especially if you're a beginner. The importance of learning how to handle the pawns really can't be overstated. But anyway, from Fischer, we now have knight to g8. f5 is of course coming next. Tal plays his c5, Fischer plays his f5, and this brings us to a very instructive moment. How should white respond to black's threat of the space-gaining f4, which could be followed by moves like g5, and then putting a knight on f6, with g4 coming, giving black a fairly ready-made kingside attack? There's no super obvious answer to this, and even the chess engines don't agree about it. Stockfish is saying just ignore it and focus on your queenside play with the move a4, while Komodo prefers the move played now by Tal, which is e takes f5, which eliminates black's prospect for the advancing f and g pawn duo after Fischer's response, g takes f5, in favor of this resulting e and f pawn duo, which is unfettered and ready to advance. But Tal is going to make the argument that this can be dealt with by playing his very strong follow-up, f4, which you might think looks a little bit strange. While it does stop the move f4, it does allow e4, giving black a passed pawn. But Fischer correctly rejects this move. Since the pawn is firmly blockaded here on d4, it's not going anywhere, and its defense can potentially be undermined with the move g4 at some point, again attacking the base of that pawn chain. And white is going to be able to just continue with his queenside play, which is still teeming with possibilities, while black's kingside counterplay has kind of come to a standstill. Now you might say, what about this half-opened g-file? Could we not get a rook to g8 and try to make something happen there? Well, this is just a bit too slow and easy for white to deal with. For example, if black tries knight g to f6 to enable rook to g8 next, this blocks the defense of the f5 pawn, which runs into trouble after knight to d4, attacking there, while threatening to jump into that nice e6 square. So knight g to f6 is no good, but where else is that backward knight really going to go? Black's minor pieces are all just kind of getting in the way of each other here. So what Fischer plays, after this f4 from Tal, is e takes f4, offering a queen trade, which Tal rejects, since he believes that he is the one with all the attacking chances here. And practically speaking, he's not wrong, but after a deep think, the engine is actually preferring queen takes e7, followed by rook takes f4, as opposed to the move played in the game, which is queen takes f4, bringing us to one of the most fascinating positions of the entire game. By declining the queen trade, Tal has offered Fischer the chance to grab a pawn on c5, a sacrifice that he didn't think Fischer would dare accept. But to Tal's utter shock, Fischer, in a stroke of absolute intuitive genius, accepts the pawn. He plays d takes c5. And the reason I call this genius is because even Stockfish doesn't realize that this move totally equalizes the position until it analyzes to a depth of almost 40 ply. And even at a depth of 26 ply, it's still recommending knight to e5 instead, although that move is actually much worse. So Bobby Fischer is showing a deeper understanding of this position based on his intuition than even Stockfish is able to achieve after looking at many millions of moves. So what's the deal with this move d takes c5 anyway? And why did Tal expect Fischer to play knight to e5 instead? Well, one of the key points to the move knight to e5 is that it prevents white's bishop from getting to d3, attacking f5. But here white can just continue to improve his position with rook a to e1, followed by knight to d4, eyeing some key squares, as black continues to suffer from his passive position, with his bad bishop blocked by its own pawn, which is a weak pawn, and with his vulnerable king, who is just kind of flapping out in the wind here. So white is much better here. But now let's take a look at Fischer's move, d takes c5, just grabbing that pawn, which if white were to recapture with b takes c5, then there's knight takes c5, controlling some nice squares, preventing that bishop to d3, which as white you'd really like to be able to play. And you can't immediately capture that knight on c5, since the recapture queen takes c5 will come with check, and then you'll lose your knight on c3. So Tal opts for a stronger move in this position, declining the recapture, and instead putting his bishop on that d3 square, which I gotta say is looking kind of scary for black. He's threatening bishop takes f5 with check, but Fischer, just fearlessly trusting in his evaluation, simply ignores that and grabs a second pawn now with c takes b4, just saying to one of the greatest attackers in the history of the game, come at me, bro. So Tal proceeds to do just that. Now, taking on f5 immediately is an option, but Tal wants to get in the move rook a to e1 first, attacking the queen, which limits black's options, since if bishop takes f5 and king to h8 are played first, then black could respond to rook a to e1 with knight to e5, opening up a counterattack on that bishop on f5, which would be pinned to the white queen. But here, after rook a to e1, Fischer has to move his queen, and this is another very instructive moment. Where should that queen go? There's only one good move for black here. See if you can spot it. Here it comes. The move is queen to d6. Fischer did not play this, but it's important to challenge the white queen so that after bishop takes f5 check and king to h8, black has two threats. He's threatening to trade queens. White doesn't want that, being the one in attack mode. And he's also threatening to win the knight on c3. Now white can move his queen with check by going to d4. When black has to block this diagonal with someone, you might think that queen to f6 is best, but the engine is then giving queen takes b4 as being totally winning for white. So I'm going to show you what Stockfish envisions here for both sides, including a move that it either missed or completely underestimated at a low search depth when the engine thought that this line gave white a sizable advantage. And for the sake of brevity, I can't get into all the crazy sub-variations here, of which there are a ton, but the most critical line goes knight d to f6. Oddly enough, you got to block with the knight. This way, b4 is still defended, and the c3 knight is attacked, so play should continue. Bishop takes c8, opening the rook's eyes to f6. Rook a takes c8, knight to e4, hitting the queen, attacking that pinned knight. Looks kind of nasty for black, and it's no wonder that Fischer wanted to avoid this, but it ain't near over. Black actually has queen takes d5 here, defended by the knight. Now, if you want to maintain any hope of winning as white, you got to keep this pin alive with queen to b2, but now we get the most engine-y of engine moves with queen to b5. What does that do? Well, it's so that after knight takes f6, there's queen to b6 check, hitting f6 so that after king to h1, the knight can take on f6. It's defended twice. So black's hanging on here, but now how are you dealing with rook to f3? Getting ready to just double up on that pinned knight? Well, you play c5. And it's not so that after rook e to f1, you can add defense with rook to c6. That was one of the engine's original ideas at a relatively low search depth, which it thought favored white. But after going deeper, it found that the cleanest path to a draw is this incredible move c4, just letting the knight go. After rook takes f6, rook takes f6, and rook takes f6, hitting the queen with the threat of a discovered check. Looks pretty bad, but here black has c3, attacking the white queen and blocking her defense of the rook. So best is going to be queen takes c3, pawn takes queen, then rook takes queen on b6, after which c2 will actually force white one way or another to part with his pony in exchange for the c2 pawn, which is about to promote. Knight to c1 doesn't help since rook to d8 comes with the threat of checkmate on d1, and black is actually winning there. So the engine was giving h3 instead of moving the knight to c1 with total equality. So this was the correct path for black, but Bobby Fischer, in this position, instead of playing the necessary queen to d6, he went for queen to f6, which is very understandable since after bishop takes f5 check, which is the most decisive move and which Tal did not play, and king to h8, at least the black queen is blocking this sensitive diagonal to the king, so there won't be any queen to d4 with check, like in the other line we looked at, but there is knight to e4, which is very strong, hitting the queen, although the engine was saying that knight to e2 followed by knight to d4 was even stronger. And again, for the sake of brevity, we gotta move on, since the move tree just explodes from here. But generally speaking, if you look at the position, it's pretty obvious how much better placed white's pieces are compared to black's, whose king is looking pretty nervous, sitting here in his battered old dilapidated castle. But Tal didn't play this winning move, which in this position was bishop takes f5 check, and instead decided to throw in rook to e6, which puts Fischer right back in the game, if and only if he declines capturing the knight on c3, which Tal is now dangling in front of him. What Fischer needs to play here is queen to g7, clearing this f6 square, ready to put the d7 knight there next with the discovered attack on the rook on e6, whose purpose for moving the e6 you really gotta question, since all it seems to be doing is just aiding black in his harmonious development. So white is still the preferred side after queen to g7, but strangely, black is able to sort of hold it together. And again, there's no time to get into all the dirty details, but queen to g7 was Fischer's ticket to freedom. Unfortunately, he did not play it. That knight on c3 was just a little too tempting, and so he does take that knight now with queen takes c3. Of course, he was surely aware that it wasn't just a completely free knight, since after bishop takes f5 check, he's now pretty much forced to sack the exchange with rook takes f5. Since if king to h8 is played, then white can force mate in 3 by taking on h6 twice. And if king to g7, then there's rook to g6 check, to which black must respond king to f7 if he is to avoid that mate in 3. But this gives white all sorts of winning moves, which take very little imagination to spot. So Fischer plays the necessary rook takes f5. We have queen takes f5 with check. The king goes back to h8. And so after this turn of events, Fischer is up in material, having a bishop, a knight, and a pawn for his rook, but against the sacrificing monster like Tal, with an exposed king and underdeveloped pieces, that little material plus is absolutely meaningless, and Tal now continues with the most crushing move in the position, rook to f3, attacking Fischer's queen, en route to the G or H file, where havoc will be wreaked. Especially crushing will be the move rook to g3 if Fischer now tries queen to g7 to try to hang back and defend his king side. So instead, Fischer plays queen to b2, staying on this all-important long diagonal, and actually threatening now to turn the tables with the move knight d to f6, attacking the e6 rook while pinning it to the white queen. So Tal responds with another best move in the position, rook to e8, pinning this knight here, threatening to take it out, followed by queen to e6 check, when the only way for black to avoid imminent mate is going to be to play king to h7, followed by sacrificing his queen after rook to f7 check with queen to g7. So Fischer goes for the most reasonable of all his losing options, which is knight to f6, with that discovered attack on the queen. And what do you think white should play here? Rook takes c8? That would win some material back, and it would be winning. But Tal plays a much stronger move, which is again the best move, queen takes f6 check, which does not simply blunder the queen, since the knight on g8 is pinned and may not recapture on f6. And so after queen takes f6 and rook takes f6, Tal is up the exchange. Fischer does have his extra pawn, but that is totally meaningless, since Tal is now threatening rook f to f8, pinning and winning in 2 different ways. And it's already looking pretty resignable for black, but Fischer has a tricky defense with the move king to g7. And after rook f to f8, when it looks like the end of the line for black, here Fischer has knight to e7, which somehow just barely holds everything together, defending the bishop on c8, and if rook takes e7, then of course the black king is going to capture on f8. But here we get an absolutely gorgeous move from Tal, the best in the position, of course, and that is knight to a5, which puts Fischer very close to a pure Zugzwang. He only has a couple of moves that don't immediately go down in flames, being just totally tied up here. You know, he can't move the bishop or he's going to lose the rook. He can't move the knight or he loses the bishop. He can't move the king or he loses the knight. So what's left? Well, he can move a pawn with h5. Tal responds h4. And now what? If c6 is played, then d6 is just the end. If b6, then that lets the knight get into c6 to eliminate the knight on e7, after which the bishop on c8 will be lost. So all Fischer really has now is rook to b8, but after knight to c4, what are you doing about d6? And after c takes d6, knight takes d6, adding a third attacker to the bishop on c8. You can try attacking the knight, as Fischer did with the move b5, but after knight to e5, Fischer sees that in addition to the devastating threat of knight to c6, there is actually a checkmate threat now present on the board, which is so devastating that the young Bobby Fischer sees no reason to continue this game, and in this position does resign to the mighty Mikhail Tal. For if Fischer were to continue with another waiting move like rook to a8, this would allow checkmate in 2 with rook to f7 check, king to h6, and rook to h8 checkmate. So what an incredible performance by the tactical powerhouse Mikhail Tal in his prime, demolishing the young Fischer as only a fellow legend of the game can. But this would be one of the last times that Tal would ever defeat Bobby Fischer, who over the next few years would go on to develop into what many still consider to be the greatest player of all time. So if you want to see more fantastic games of the great Bobby Fischer or Tal, or both at the same time, like you did here, first of all, you should check out this video right here, if you haven't already, and then consider subscribing to the channel. And as always, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.